بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Continuing the station of Istiqaamah, uprightness, we reached the three levels of Istiqaamah in which Abu Ismail al-Harawi rahimahullah ta'ala says وهي على ثلاث درجات. الدرجة الأولى الاستقامة على الاجتهاد في الاقتصاد لا عاديا رسم العلم ولا متجاوزا حد الإخلاص ولا مخالفا نهج السنة. So here, the first level of uprightness, and remember, when we say istiqamah, we are referring to being on the straight path in terms of our actions and our beliefs, right? That there is a right way of doing things in Islam and there's a wrong way of doing things. There are things that are accepted and there are things that are rejected. And as we've mentioned plenty of times before, that in order for a good deed to be accepted, then it needs to meet two conditions. Right? The first is sincerity, and the second is to do it in accordance with the Sharia. Right? And that, in other words, that we do not have the freedom to worship Allah the way we want. Right? Nor do we have the freedom to intend in our worship other than pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is kind of the basic, and this is where Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala is starting off in the first level. That this is something everyone needs to perform, and he's just giving us a little bit more kind of nuanced detail in terms of how to remain in istiqamah. Right? So if our goal before doing an action is to make sure that we are sincere and to make sure that what we are doing is in accordance to Islam, well, how do we preserve that? Right? How do we continue to apply istiqamah in our actions? How do we stay on the path of istiqamah? He says that at the first level, الاستقامة على الاجتهاد في الاقتصاد, right? That when we do efforts on the straight path, that we do it economically. So iqtisad, the word iqtisad means economically. And here I don't mean it as a science. I mean it in its more linguistic definition, in which it means not wastefully, right? So economy class, for example, in the airplane, why do they call it economy class? It's just a polite way of saying that you're not putting too much money on this flight. Or a car that is economical in its gas consumption means it's a car that uses gas at a very, very effective, in a very effective way. You're getting 30 plus miles per gallon instead of other cars that get less than 20. So what does it mean to be economical in our actions? Well, it means to not be wasteful in the efforts and our striving towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here it's not about the action itself, but rather how do we make our action, how do we perform our ijtihad, how do we do ijtihad in a way where we're not wasting our effort. Because we know that some people, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us, they might do a lot, but because of their insincerity, or because they are not doing it in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but rather they're doing it in a way that pleases themselves, we know that all their actions, all their reward is nullified. Excuse me. Okay, so how do we do that? Excuse me, I have an itch in my throat. Let me get this out. So how do we apply this understanding? Basically, it is by not falling into two bad practices. The first is what's called ifrat, and the other is called tafrit. Ifrat is when, if you think of kind of the ideological spectrum, how they say there's the right and there's the left? Yeah. There is the kind of the extremist, and then there's the extremely conservative and extremely liberal. You have these two ends. Well, when we do actions, right, there is an extremeness in one way, and there's another type of an extremeness. To the right, it is an extremeness in terms of the application itself, that when we apply something, we go beyond what the Sharia is telling us to do. And by beyond, I don't mean we are excelling. I don't mean we are doing sunan and nawafil, right? I mean they are doing things the Sharia did not tell us to do. Right? It did not encourage us to do it. It did not tell us to do it. In fact, just the fact that the Sharia did not tell us to do it means we're not supposed to do it. So, for example, someone who, let's say, they're leading salah, congregational prayer, and they read Surah Al-Baqarah, right, in Fajr prayer, all of it, right? Now, although that's not haram in of itself, but the Sharia told us, or the Prophet ﷺ told us not to do that, right? That's a type of excessiveness in terms of how much we apply and the way we apply it. Another example is fasting 24 hours, right? 24/7. That a person, they think out of piety, or it is pious that they fast for longer than the Sharia tells us to fast. In Islam, fasting is from Fajr to Maghrib, from dawn till sunset. That is fasting. So for someone to begin fast before or to continue fast after, I understand there's difference of opinion among scholars, but for someone to do it in a 24-hour succession, they fast, for example, 3 days without eating or drinking anything. That's something the Sharia tells us not to do, right, because of the harm it has. That's the ifrat side. Right? The other side, tafriq, is not doing what we are supposed to do. Removing from what the Sharia tells us to do. Removing things from the Sharia that the Sharia tells us to do. So an extreme example of that is someone who says, I don't want to pray all 5 daily prayers, I'm just going to pray 3. That is tafriq. Alaikum salam. Or for someone another extreme example, to say, I don't want to pray 4 rak'ahs for Isha, I'm going to pray 3. Right? These are extreme examples. You won't really find this, but something that you might find is a type of looseness in the obligation status of some of these acts of worship. So that's the kind of the two angles, the two extremities here that we want to avoid. So when Abu Ismail says al-iqtisad, al-ijtihad fil iqtisad, that we put a lot of effort in making sure that we are economical in our application of the religion, it means we are kind of on that middle path where we're not doing more than what the Sharia is telling us to do, right? As if the Sharia is telling us to do it, and we're not doing less than what the Sharia is telling us and obligating us to do, right? And essentially the shaitan will come and study the individual. He'll study their psyche, he'll study their behaviors, right? Their history, and they're observing them for many years to try and find certain characteristics. Is this person of type A or type B personality? Is this person the more aggressive personality or the kind of more cautious personality, right? He'll kind of get a feel for this individual, how they behave. And then based on that, they will try and exploit their weaknesses in order to get them to ifrat or tafrit. Okay? Some people will have more leniency towards that aggressiveness, especially younger individuals, right? They want to pray all night and fast all day, and they think everyone else is lesser, inferior to their iman. This is very common in religiously youth who are very rigorous and enthusiastic about practicing Islam. And on the other side, kind of the more liberal end, don't worry, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Ghafur Rahim, He forgives, enjoy your life, do what you need to do. Don't worry about Islam now, you could do it later on in your life. Just worry about your career, making money, getting a home, establishing yourself in this life. among that. And then, so the shaitan kind of senses where this individual is in that spectrum, and then exploits that to get them either in the side of ifrat or tafrit. So Abu Ismail is telling us that we need to put a lot of effort, al-ijtihad fil iqtisad. We need to put a lot of effort in making sure that we don't fall into one of these two extremities. Right? And the fact that he's saying al-ijtihad, you have to put effort in doing this. It's not something that comes naturally. Right? It's something that is a struggle, that is part of the struggle of iman. Why? Because you have the force of the shaitan trying to sway you either way. You also have your own desires that fluctuates and changes over time and over periods of life. Right? You go through phases. Personalities kind of change at different times and different parts of their life. So it requires a amount of effort. Also, in order to know what the correct way of applying Islam is, you need to study it, and that requires effort. Right? So we need that effort in making sure we have an economical application, a modern application of Islam. لا عاديا رسم العلم. Right? And essentially the goal of this being in this place on the spectrum, the goal here is to not overpass, to not overlook the knowledge of Islam. So in order to be economical in our application of Islam, right, that entails us to apply Islam in accordance to knowledge, right, not in accordance to our personalities, not in accordance to our own whims and our own desires. Rather, there is knowledge. Allah told us how to worship Him, and the Prophet ﷺ told us and showed us how to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the knowledge aspect, and we need to apply Islam in that manner. وَلَا مُتَجَاوِزًا حَدَّ الْإِخْلَاصِ, and not transgressing or passing the boundaries of sincerity. So we spoke about sincerity, I believe, in the previous station, or the one before that, and so we got an idea of what ikhlas is. So Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala here is saying that we need to be in ikhlas, and in order to be economical in our application, that entails us to be sincere in the application. Right? Why? Because without sincerity, your actions aren't accepted. And the previous one, without knowledge, without knowledge, you cannot apply Islam in accordance to the Sharia, and thus the person will lose that privilege of the reward of their actions being accepted, right? Because they didn't do it the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told them. وَلَا مُخَالِفًا نَهْجَ السُّنَّةِ, and without contradicting, without disobeying the way of the Sunnah, right? So without contradicting the way the Prophet ﷺ did things. So in one hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, صَلُّوا كَمَا رَأَيْتُمُونِي أُصَلِّي, pray as you saw me praying. خُذُوا عَنِّي مَنَاسِكَكُمْ, take from me your rituals of Hajj, right? Among other statements in Quran and Hadith. In other words, the reason why one of the reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent us the Prophet ﷺ is to show us how to apply His scripture. The Quran is giving us words, giving us information, right? And our mindset, each person's mindset differs from the other. And not everyone has the ability, the intellectual capacity to fully grasp the theoretical, the abstract, the deep ideas being presented in the Quran. Not everyone is an intellectual. So for those who can and have the time to study it and analyze the Quran and look at what the classical scholar said, then more power to them. They should do that. But for those who don't have the time, or studying is just not their forte. Some people are like that. They're more a hands-on person. They're more of an activist type personality. Then they can look to the way of the Prophet ﷺ, the way he applied it, to have that kind of illustration of how Islam is applied. Right? So وَلَا مُخَالِفًا نَهْجَ السُنَّةِ. The second level of istiqamah is استقامة الأحوال وهي شهود الحقيقة لا كسبا ورفض الدعوة لا علما والبقاء مع نور اليقظة لا تحفظا. So the second level of uprightness, of istiqamah, is istiqamah in our state of spirituality. So the previous one is talking about our physical, bodily application of Islam. Right? There needs to be this application that is moderate. Right? I don't mean moderate in terms of our ideological and political understanding of the word. I just mean moderate in terms of it's not in one of the two extremes that I mentioned before. That's the physical body, right? The second one is the state of mind, the state of spirituality. What's going on in the heart? How does my heart achieve this uprightness in terms of our relationship with Allah and our practice of the Sharia? Right? Now, if the person, right, is applying Islam, applying the Sharia in a particular way, then one can assume that the way they apply the religion will, whether they recognize it or not, will have an effect on the way they perceive the self, the way they perceive their own relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and who He is. Right? So for example, the Khawarij, who the Prophet ﷺ describes as people who, he's telling this to the companions, and he's not telling this to us. He's saying this to the companions. Saying the companions, talking to the companions, says, when you look at their salah, you will belittle your own salah in comparison with their salah. You will belittle your fasting in comparison with their fasting. You will belittle your recitation of the Quran and your relationship with the Quran when you look at the way they apply these things. But what does the Prophet then say? He says, لا يجاوز, what's the word? I forgot. What they say, what they recite from the Quran will not leave their throats. In other words, it's nothing more than words to them, because they lack the understanding of it. Now, is it a coincidence that people who have this extreme application of the religion, right? By extreme, I mean it is not in accordance with the Sharia, or it lacks the substance that the Sharia gives to these applications. Meaning, when they pray, when they fast, when they recite the Quran, it is empty. It's like an empty shell. Why? Because they don't understand the purpose of it. They don't understand what this is meant to do, right? Although they know what they're doing, they're cognizant of it, they just don't know the depth, the core of the meaning of salah. Why did Allah prescribe salah? To them, it's nothing more than Allah said so, and if you don't pray, you're going to hellfire. It doesn't go beyond that, right? So is it a coincidence that people who have this extreme, unorthodox application of Islam also have this extreme personalities? They have this extreme way of presenting Islam. They have an extreme way of dealing with other Muslims and other human beings. Is it a coincidence? I mean, I can't conclude, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a relationship there. Is there a relationship that someone who is what we call more liberal in their lifestyle, right, is more liberal in their application of the religion? Or if someone understands Islam and they were taught Islam in a way that is very loose, oh, don't worry about it, when you're older you can practice Islam, or just you're a younger kid now, go ahead and talk to the other gender, go out with them, it's okay, no problem, just don't go a little bit too far, but it's okay, don't worry about that stuff now, we're in America. Is it a coincidence that people who are raised with this mentality, this perception of and this application of the religion also develop this loose understanding of the religion itself? I don't think there's a coincidence there, but that requires studies to confirm. So starting off the first level with this physical application, and then going into the spiritual understanding, the spiritual uprightness, kind of tells us that Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala and the spiritualists kind of saw a relationship there. That before the internal part of our iman becomes upright, there needs to be an uprightness in the physical application, right? Well, why does he start with the physical before the internal, even though the internals is maybe more important? Perhaps because at the first level, he's addressing a much broader audience, right? He's addressing every single believer. Every believer should at least be at the first level and apply the first level of all of these stations, right? And what is obligatory in Islam is, fulfilling the obligations of Islam, praying the 5 daily prayers. Someone who prays their 5 daily prayers, but their khushu' in salah isn't that strong, we assume that they will be successful in the next life. They might not reach the highest levels of paradise, right? But nonetheless, Allah subhanahu, I don't know of a hadith or a verse that suggests that someone who applies the obligations of Islam, fulfills the obligations, but their fulfillment is kind of void of that strong spiritual connection. I don't know that the Sharia threatens such individuals with punishment or not accepting their deeds. So the first level is the physical, because everyone needs to do this. It's an obligation on everyone. The second one is the spiritual, because now we can reach a higher level of the application. And how do we fulfill uprightness in our spiritual state? وَهِيَ شُهُودُ الْحَقِيقَةِ لَا كَسْبًا. So haqiqah is reality, the truth of reality. When you look at the universe around you, you perceive it in a particular way. And from person to person, the perception of life is going to differ, right? It can differ even quite drastically. The way an atheist or an agnostic or someone who doesn't believe in organized religion, the way they view life is going to be quite different than the way someone who subscribes to a religion that promotes the notion of an afterlife, the way they see life, right? A Muslim views life as temporary, as a place of a test, right? This isn't a reward. It's not good enough to be a reward, and it's not bad enough to be a punishment. Death is real, right? And death is something that believers don't shy away from speaking of and contemplating and thinking of, right? The emphasis in Islam is on the afterlife, not this life. Now compare that to an atheist who completely rejects a notion of an afterlife. Well, they only have this life. And they believe that this life is meant to be something good, something positive. This is a life where, you have to live life to its fullest. These are two very different mentalities, right? So how do we understand the haqiqah of this existence, right? How do we understand the reality, the truth of this reality that we are presently in? And there are two types of haqiqahs. The first one is al-haqiqah al-kawniyya, the reality of the natural world around us. And the second one is the reality of our religion. So you have two realities, right? And they don't contradict, they're not separate, right? But the way we approach each might have some slight differences. So you have the reality of our existence, our physical existence, the natural existence, and then you have the reality of our religious identity. And what combines the two, ويجمعهما حقيقة ثالثة وهي مصدرها ومنشأهما وأكثر أرباب سلوكها. Where does he say this? Anyway, right, so you have these two realities. How do we perceive our physical reality and how do we perceive our religious reality? And as I said, there is no contradiction between the two. They're not separate, but these are two different realities that might have slightly different implications. But nonetheless, the Sharia gives us, the Quran and Sunnah give us a very effective way of reconciling these two things, right? And we've spoken about that before, and maybe we'll speak about it later. So when they mention the reality of the physical world, right, the natural world, What it means is, how do we understand our place in this reality, and how do we understand the purpose of the reality itself? Right? What is this life? Well, we said that this life, according to the Quran, is a test. And in our mindset today, a test is something that's quite negative. We don't like tests because you take tests at school, you take tests at doctor's office. They test your blood, you test other things, and there's that anxiety that's attached to the test. But perhaps the meaning of a test in the Islamic sense, it's broader than just the negative part that we are quite accustomed to. It also includes kind of that opportunity that by being tested in this life, by perceiving life as a test, it means there is a right and a wrong. It means that there is a greater goal. You don't take a test unless there is some goal you're trying to reach, right? If a person takes a test at school, it is to get a good grade. Well, why do you want a good grade? Well, to get a good job, etc. In the end, right? To make good money. There's a goal. There's something that gives meaning and purpose through a test or because of a test and whatnot. Also, recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sovereignty in this universe, how He does things, how He organizes things, how He controls things. So, observing the reality, وَهِيَ شُهُودُ الْحَقِيقَةِ لَا كَسْبًا, right? Abu Ismail is saying that observing the reality is critical and important to having spiritual uprightness, because the more we are able to observe Allah's sovereignty on this universe, the more we are able to incorporate the purpose of this universe and the purpose of our presence in this universe, the more it humbles us in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more it refines and defines the spiritual state. Right? Someone who views life as a party, their heart is going to be quite different than someone who views life as a phase that we are meant to utilize to get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and invest in the afterlife. Right? This is going to be two quite different hearts. And because of that differences, the emotional reactions of the hearts will be different as well. How does an atheist perceive fear in comparison to a believer? How does he or she perceive fear? These are going to be two very different things. How is an atheist going to react to a state of fear in comparison to a believer, and how he is going to or she is going to react to the state of fear? When a believer feels fear, what do? They reach out to Allah. When an atheist feels fear, what do they do? I don't think there's a specific thing, but it's not going to be reaching out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, uprightness in our spiritual state requires our hearts and our spirituality to be defined in a positive way. And in order to do that, we need to have a true and strong understanding of our natural world and our presence in it. The second one, the reality of our religious reality. What is our religious reality? Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi says, فَإِنَّهُ فِي مَشْهَدِ الْأَمْرِ وَالنَّهِي وَالثَّوَابِ وَالْعِقَابِ وَالْمُوَالَاةِ وَالْمُعَادَاةِ وَالْفَرْقِ بَيْنَ مَا يُحِبُّهُ اللَّهُ وَيَرْضَاهُ وَبَيْنَ مَا يُبْغِضُهُ وَيَسْخَطُهُ. The reality of our religious self is defined and shaped by our relationship and our perception of Allah's commands and prohibitions, reward and punishment, allegiance and disavowing, meaning allegiance to Allah and disavowing the enemies of Allah, that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not like, and focusing on what Allah focusing and discerning what Allah loves and is pleased with versus what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes and angers Him. Right? In other words, in this last point, when I look at, for example, this bottle of water, drinking water, what is Allah's opinion with drinking water? Right? Is it something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves? He wants me to do or no? Right? When I look at, for example, the internet, this phone, is the internet something that pleases Allah or something that displeases Him? Now the internet, of course, in general, it's mubah, it's permissible, but the content on the internet that a person can access, the time that is wasted, scrolling through a person's feed, we're all guilty of this. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, protect us, really. It's a huge, huge fitna. Is that something that pleases Allah or not? Right? And the point here is not to answer these questions, but to develop a mindset, the religious mindset. How do we define it? What shapes it? It is these questions. When I look at this, for example, prayer. Why do I pray? Well, a good answer, a healthy answer is because Allah told me to. I submit to Allah. An unhealthy answer is to try and, give it a modern twist. Praying is kind of a cooler yoga. Meditation. I pray because I'm meditating. And meditation is kind of a fad, something trending in our times today. Right? That is an unhealthy answer because it completely excludes Allah and that connection to Allah that prayer is meant to establish. Right? How do I understand the prohibition? If someone asks me, why don't you drink alcohol, for example? A healthy answer is because Allah prohibited it. Right? It doesn't mean that we cannot give the wisdom behind it. Of course, that's also part of the answer and building that certitude in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. But an unhealthy answer is to kind of give it that modern twist. Right? Oh, I don't drink alcohol because, accidents happen. Yeah, that's true. But it's an unhealthy answer because it excludes Allah from the answer, really. Same thing with reward and punishment. Why do I pray? I want the reward. Allah promises reward, and I believe in His promises, and I trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to fulfill His promises. Why do I stay away from sins? Because I am afraid of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment. These are healthy answers, right? Among the other aspects that are mentioned here. So, shuhud al-haqiqa la kasban. Observing these realities, right? But observing them, incorporating them in our realities, and shaping ourselves, our physical, our presence in this world, and our spiritual selves, religious selves, la kasban, not because, or without avoiding the trick of the shaitan of getting the person to think that this spiritual uprightness is the result of personal effectiveness, the result of my own accomplishments and achievements. Rather, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who gives us this. Right? If a person sees the world for what it really is, if a person has a healthy attachment to their religiosity or the natural world, then it is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who gave us the tawfiq to reach that point. It is because it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who showed us the reality. It is Allah who opened our minds and opened our hearts to grasping the reality of our existence, our religious and natural or physical existence, right? Not that I am the one who accomplished this. Why is this important to our spiritual uprightness? Because spirituality, all of our emotions, right? When Islam, when the Quran, when Hadith address our emotions, which is the essence of our internal spirituality, right? Essentially what the Sharia does for us is directs these emotions to a common point, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have emotions. We have the emotion of joy, happiness, fear, anxiety, stress, worry, etc., among other things. We cannot destroy these emotions. Right? We cannot avoid these emotions. We cannot suppress them. In fact, suppressing them might cause even more damage. So the Sharia doesn't take that approach. Rather, it takes all of these emotions and directs them to Allah. If you feel fear, then go to Allah for protection. And if you have fear in your heart, and we all have fear in our hearts, then make sure that fear is ascribed to Allah, because when we fear Allah, right, when our fear is directed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it frees us from fearing anyone or anything else. Same thing with happiness, same thing with worry, all of this directed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by doing this, essentially, we develop this wahdaniyya, this fardaniyya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this oneness of Allah, right? In that, in the first stage, my physical body is applying the religion in a way where it's centered around Allah. I apply the religion the way Allah told me to, for the sake of Allah. The second stage is my spirituality is all now being directed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not dispersed all over the place, where I have fear of 1,000 things. No, I only have fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and my fear of Allah frees me from fearing anything else, because He is the sovereign. Instead of joy being dispersed between hundreds of things, rather my joy is in my relationship with Allah, and that suffices me, that gratifies me, that satisfies my need for joy, instead of having to pursue it in all of these other things. Right? So the person's world becomes completely centered, the reality becomes completely centered around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So observing reality without falling into the trick or the trap of self-accomplishment. The second essence of the second level is rafdu da'wa la ilman, is rejecting self-claim and not knowledge. What does this mean? We said that this term da'wa, when it's used in spirituality, it means that a person claims something for the self, right? And of course here in the spiritual context, in the religious context, if I pray 5 times a day, that is not because of my own self-accomplishment. Rather, it is Allah who gave me the tawfiq to pray 5 times a day, right? That's what's meant by da'wah. And we reject this. As soon as we begin to think, and the shaitan will throw this in our mind, oh, so-and-so, man, good job. You did well today in terms of religion. You prayed your 5 daily prayers. Good job. You are doing awesome, right? He tries to do this. Why? To make us slip, to make our religiosity centered around the self instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is one of his most subtle tricks, that a person might live their entire life without noticing. And the only way they'll notice it is if knowledge comes to them, as we were talking about today. It's such a subtle trick, and it's so insidious, right? It's so dangerous, but subtle at the same time, which makes it extremely dangerous. So being cautious of this. If I feel a spiritual state, you know how in Ramadan we all feel our iman is high and it feels so good, especially the last 10 nights of Ramadan. Man, it feels so good and my spirituality is so high, right? We need to make sure that if we feel this, then we know and remember that it is Allah blessing me with this feeling. He is the one who's giving me this feeling as a gift, right? To bring me closer to Him, to raise my status in the next life, instead of saying that it's my own doing and my own efforts. Right? And then a person rejects this self-claim, not because of their knowledge of its problematic nature. What does this mean here? In other words, what happens many times, right now, we've kind of been alerted to this problem, right? And the next time we feel a spiritual state, what's going to happen? We're going to tell ourselves, oh, no, that's not allowed. I can't do that. Why? I learned that this isn't healthy. Well, Abu Ismail, rahimahullah ta'ala, is saying that that's not enough. Just because you know this is unhealthy and you tell yourself that I reject this, right, does not necessarily mean that your heart is rejecting it. Let me give you an example. A person knows that eating this type of food is very unhealthy, right? It's too fatty, right? So many calories. It's not good for the person. If I continue to eat this, right, then it can cause me some health problems later on in life, right? Why are they saying this? Because they learned about it. They read it in an article. They read it in a scholarly, in scholarly research, etc. The mind has accepted it. Oh, I eat this. Oh no, I can't eat this anymore, right? Your mind is telling you, I cannot eat this anymore. But your heart still wants it. Your heart still finds it very tasty. Your heart has a desire for it. Now, you might be able to, overpower your desire for a period of time. Every time you want to eat that nice, meal that is very greasy and fatty, right? Your mind might be successful in convincing you otherwise, dissuading you, but eventually if that desire remains, right, one day that desire is going to overpower the intellect. This is what Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala is saying, that simply knowing that self-claim to righteousness and spirituality, simply knowing that that's bad, is not an effective way of changing the heart. Because just because your mind knows that this is bad does not mean your heart doesn't like it. Does not mean that your heart will reject it. Right? So we want the heart to reject it. How do we reach that level? See, the first part is simple. It's easy to grasp, it's easy to understand. The second part, well, how do I change my heart? We can change our minds. We can learn. We can develop our minds pretty simply, pretty easily. But changing the heart, it's quite different. How do we do that? Right? How do we do that? It is through the tool and the more powerful emotion of love. In other words, we will not leave something we love except for something we love more. If we love, we all love feeling good about ourselves. And since we are religiously inclined and dedicated, we like to feel that holiness, that sanctimony. We like to feel that. And because of that love for that feeling of self-righteousness, it's very difficult to overcome that challenge. And therefore, it'll be ineffective to try and suppress it. And the only effective means of getting through that or over it is by developing our love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If my love for Allah is more than my love for myself, then it should be easier for me to do this because it pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if I'm still very attached to the self and the love of the self, how am I going to prefer Allah over myself? How am I going to do this because it pleases Allah, right, at the expense of doing it because it makes me feel good? So we need to find that love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the way forward. Developing that love for Allah will minimize and undo our attachment to other than Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, and then the third essence or the third element of this level, the second level, is al-baqa'u ma'a nur al-yaqadha. La tahaffudan, is staying with the light of spiritual awakening. Right? Not tahaffuz, not out of protection, as we'll understand in a moment. Out of self-protection. So, if you remember, the very first stage, the very first station was the station of yaqadha, spiritual awakening. That before we can even pursue Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need to awaken our minds and our hearts to the reality that we exist in, to the reality of our purpose, Without that, then what's the point of pursuing spirituality? Right? What is the point of pursuing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if we don't believe we're going to return to Him? It makes no sense. So he is referring to the spiritual awakening or spiritual consciousness as a nur, as light. And it is something that we need to constantly be reminding ourselves of. Because like the body gets tired and needs sleep, our spirituality can get exhausted and want to sleep. But unlike our bodies, our spirituality doesn't need sleep. Right? So we need to constantly remind ourselves of our purpose in order to stay within or under that light, the nur of spiritual awakeness. And we do that not in the perception that we are preserving and protecting ourselves, but rather that by doing that we are blessed with the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the intention of the individual, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deals with each individual based on their intention. If my intention in constantly waking myself up spiritually is because I want to be near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah will help me in that regard by protecting me and keeping me in that light. Right? Does that make sense? And then finally, the third level, just to conclude this station, the third level of al-Istiqaamah is استقامة بترك رؤية الاستقامة وبالغيبة عن تطلب الاستقامة بشهود الإقامة وتقويمه الحق. Here, this is something that he said before, this idea where part of spirituality is to avoid looking at our spirituality, if that makes any sense. In other words, when we apply certain things in Islam, we as human beings, even outside of religiosity, we have a tendency to kind of observe ourselves. That, oh, look at, I did a good job, right? Or look, yeah, I did what I'm supposed to do. And essentially, what this does is, if our goal as spiritual believers is to put all of our energy and our senses and our emotions directed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so kind of imagining here, I want everything about me to be looking up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What he's saying here, and he's said in other stations, is that if we do not disconnect ourselves from observing our own practices, essentially what happens is instead of looking up, we look at the self. Right? Let me put this in a different way. As some Ibn Ata'ullah has said, what he means here is the following. When we practice Islam, as we've all experienced, there is a type of joy and pleasure that comes with it. Right? And that joy and pleasure can create a veil between the person and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because the focus becomes centered on the feeling itself and the pursuit of that feeling, instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the center. Right? In other words, why do I do this? It should be because Allah wants me to. Allah has commanded me to do this. Right? What is the feeling that I am pursuing? It should be Allah's pleasure. What is the end goal I am pursuing? It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure. But in this third stage here, he's saying that if we look at ourselves, if we have this observance of the self, when we apply these stations, right? Essentially what happens is, the reason why I'm doing it is because there's something in it for me, and the emotion or the feeling that I am pursuing is that joy that I feel. And again, this is very subtle. And this is a veil between the individual and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is quite tricky. So this is what he means here, that we need to remove that veil by cutting that connection with the self. How can we do that? I mean, how can our feelings become secondary to our decisions? How can our self-interests become secondary to how can our self-interest become secondary to our pursuit of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? I think this is something that we need to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for. And if we try and develop strategies in succeeding in this regard, I think we just put ourselves back at point one. That, okay, I developed these strategies to remove that veil between me and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then you kind of fall into another veil, just kind of at a different station of Iman. So perhaps this is something that just comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what Abu Ismail mentions is the shuhud, the observance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Going back to this notion that the more we observe Allah's place, or Allah's sovereignty, I should say, Allah's sovereignty over our natural physical reality and our religious reality, the more it kind of centers Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala around ourselves, or we become centered around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead of the opposite way. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. And that concludes the station of al-Istiqaamah, and the station of tawakkul follows bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, which will begin next week. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.